Well, today is, I guess this is October the 14th, 2020, 2020. And I happen to be sitting here today with an old high school graduate friend of mine in the class of 1961, Simon Kenton High School, Ed Roulette. And Edgar and I played some basketball together, went to school together. I always admired him tremendously because he had some great academic skills. And I always was impressed by his abilities to do math and complicated things. And he's always been busy, so see who that is, Edgar. Say hello to him. If you need to talk to him, go right ahead and talk to them. Anybody we know?
No.
Oh, okay. Now, but as you can tell, he's a busy man. So catching him from coming in here from Texas, I'll start off with, where do you live out there in Texas now, Edgar?
I live in a town called Schertz. It's just north of San Antonio, about probably 10 miles.
And how long have you been out there in Texas now?
I think pretty much going on 14 or 15 years.
14 or 15 years. Well, now I'm going to take you back to the beginning of times because, Ed, your life is a life that every American, including myself, are proud of how you have served your country in the Air Force, and you were there for 20 years?
20 years, 1 month.
20 years and 1 month, and retired from the Air Force.
Yes, sir, sure did.
And so I'd like to cover that territory, but I'm going to take you all the way back to where you were born and where you grew up. Now, where were you born?
Born at St. Elizabeth Hospital in Covington, Kentucky.
And what year was that? Do you
1943.
1943. And your birth date then is?
March the 1st.
March the 1st of 1943. Now, do you remember the house you grew up in?
I actually remember the house I grew up in was on Warren Avenue.
It was Warren Avenue, Covington.
Well, it's Covington now. Back then it was probably Fort Mitchell years ago.
Years ago. Isn't that something?
Yeah.
And now, were you have any brothers and sisters?
I had a brother, Jim, and a sister, Carolyn, and a half-sister, Judy.
And your mom and dad were names of them, mom and dad?
My mother's name was, her maiden name was Dorothy Perkins, and my dad's name was Edwin Samuel Roulette.
Edwin Samuel Roulette. Fantastic. Now, where did you go to grade school then?
Kenton Elementary.
You went to Kenton Elementary
But
now?
of course, first I went to, Kenton Elementary wasn't built, so I went to an old building that was dilapidated, which is in Independence.
Independence, and I think it's a little apartment building now, isn't
It's
it?
an apartment building now, that's exactly right.
You and I both went there, didn't we?
Absolutely, we sure did. Right across the street from the Kenton County Jail, I think, or Independence Jail.
Independence Jail.
Yeah.
I probably should have been there a few times for disorderly conduct or something.
Yeah, we all should have.
But I have to commend you, Ed, and you went there, and then you went to Kenton Elementary, and I think Kenton Elementary was started about in 1952, I think it was.
That's about right.
And did you have Mr. Kenton then for a principal there?
We did.
And wonderful man, wasn't
He
he?
certainly was.
And do you remember some of your teachers from elementary school?
I remember a lot of them. Well, I remember my first grade teacher was Mrs. Wagner, Miss Wagner.
Miss Wagner, Randolph Wagner's wife.
Absolutely.
Wonderful lady.
And I had Mrs. Antrobus,
Mrs. Antrobus. Mrs. Cooper, did you have her?
Mrs. Cooper,
Yeah, Mrs. Cooper. And Mrs. Shropshire.
Mrs. Shropshire, absolutely, married to the coach.
Yeah, yeah.
I think his name was Bill, maybe Shropshire, I'm not sure.
And then, let's see now, who else did we have there? Mr. Bailey,
Mr. Bailey.
I think 5th grade, and Mrs. Riley. No, she was in 7th.
If you recall, we went to Simon Kenton in the 7th
Seventh
because
grade.
there was no middle school.
That's right,
So we started 7th grade, so we were little bitty kids in with seniors who were big kids.
right.
So we were the tiny kids in class. So we went to 7th, 8th grade at Simon Kenton, and then of course we became freshmen. My goodness, that had to have been in the 57 or 8 maybe.
Yep, yep,
And, you know, because we graduated in 61.
right.
So, yeah, we attended Simon Kenton and instead of being in Simon Kenton for 4 years, we were actually there for 6 because it started in 7th grade.
Right. I had Mrs. Riley for world geography in the 7th grade, I think it was, and at Simon Kenton.
I think I did too.
And she was an excellent, excellent teacher. And you had, some of the other teachers that I recall, Mrs. Easton for
The ones that
typing,
I
I
really,
believe, Mrs. Wright for art
oh yeah,
class, Mrs. Wright. And you remember Mrs. Heitman?
oh very well. Mrs. Hyman was the only teacher that I had in school that I visited after I was in the Air Force.
How wonderful.
Because I really liked Mrs. Hyman, and she actually lived where we went to grade school in that apartment building.
Mm-hmm.
She lived in that apartment building, and I went to her house and saw her and stayed about an hour. And she was doing well then. She was doing okay, and she had been retired for a few years. Now, interestingly, we were talking earlier, when my brother and sister went to Simon Kenton, my brother and her were there, well, I don't know exactly what year my sister started, but my brother was there in 1949 as a freshman. And Mrs. Hyman and Mr. Roden, Mrs. Taylor, and R.C. Richardson was the principal in 1949. And those are the same people we had.
R.C. Hinsdale, you mean? Or?
R.C. Hinsdale, yeah, I said R.C. Richardson, R.C. Hinsdale.
Right.
Those are the same people we had when we graduated in 1961.
61, yeah.
So they had been there a long time. They were fixtures.
They were fixtures. Our last year, our senior year, was when Mr. Hinsdale had retired and Mr. Edmondson
Mr. Edmondson.
came in the last year. We were his first class.
Absolutely. And Mr. Edmondson was such a nice guy that he got me a summer job, working at Camp Ernst.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. And
He
Mr.
was a
Edmondson,
wonderful gentleman, wasn't he?
He absolutely was. A great guy.
He used to say, I broke him in. As a principal.
We probably broke him, period. Some of my favorite teachers in school, of course, Mrs. Hyman, and I think Mrs. Hinsdale, the history teacher.
Excellent history
I think
teacher.
I learned a lot about history, and I like J.B. Losey.
Yes,
He was
typing
my
teacher,
typing
business teacher.
Business teacher.
Still alive, still going strong.
Yeah.
And then we have Mrs. Brown. Do you remember
Oh,
Mrs.
yeah,
Brown?
sure do.
Had her. I was in her house 2 or 3 times for classes that we went to her home for.
Mrs. Brown taught, I think, English and Spanish.
Yes.
And when I was in Spanish class, I was a terrible Spanish student. Still can't speak Spanish today. But Mrs. Brown wrote her thesis. I saw it for her master's degree. She wrote that, and it was graded by a professor. And he said it was in Spanish, written in Spanish. And he said it was the best one he had ever written or read. And she got the highest grade you could get on it, and there was no grammar errors in it.
Isn't that amazing?
That's amazing to me.
Well, it is, and she was quite talented, and a great blessing for us students to have someone.
Absolutely.
And then
Absolutely.
Mr. Gaynor Caldwell, we had him for government.
I remember Mr. Caldwell very well, and I remember the shop teacher,
Yeah, Mr. Holbrook,
Mr. Holbrook.
Grover Holbrook. He did an excellent job.
Yes, he did.
And Mr. Bowie,
Mr. Bowen.
Mr. Bowen,
Mr. Bowen, science.
and Mr. Lewin.
Yeah.
We had Mr. Lewin in science and different classes. And then, of course, Mr. Gay Best, who's still alive.
Oh, yeah.
Had him for algebra and plane geometry.
I had him for algebra and plane geometry. And Mr. Best also became the principal of Swinhoffel
Yes,
later on.
right.
Mr. Best hunted at my grandmother's farm, hunted squirrels. I get permission to hunt from my grandmother.
Oh, how
And he
wonderful.
would come up there and hunt. And Mr. Best would come to the basketball games.
Yes.
And I'm not 100% sure, but I'm thinking he graduated from Eastern Kentucky State Teachers College, I think.
Probably did. I'm not sure on that, but he was a very good math teacher.
Yes,
I know
he
that.
was.
And
And I was a poor math student.
well, to me, you were always an excellent student. We looked up to you.
Yeah.
And well, those are Simon Kenton. I'm trying to think of Mrs. Wright, who taught art.
Yeah.
Wonderful lady. And I'm trying to, I don't want to leave anybody out here. I'm trying to think of
Mr. Taylor was the basketball
Robert
coach.
Taylor, basketball coach, English teacher, and his wife was a counselor,
Yeah.
Mrs. Taylor. And then there was another Mrs. Taylor who was a math teacher that lived out on Rector Road, an older lady who was an excellent teacher.
Yeah.
And then we graduated in 1961. I think there was about 120 of us, maybe 125,
I think probably about 120.
something like that. And of course, there's not too many of us left now.
No, that's true.
They've gone on to heaven. A lot of us have. But I wanted to sort of trace you from high school. Now you worked while you were in high school, doing
Yes,
a
I
lot of
did.
different jobs, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. I worked in high school primarily. I worked for a fellow named Needham Wilson that had a farm. I cut thistles out of his sheep pasture and put in loose hay and baled hay. Hated the loose hay because the hay seed got all over you and
Oh yeah,
made you itch real bad.
itch you to death.
Yeah. And then I got a job working for Al Berryman, mixing mortar in a mortar box. And he built rock walls. He built a rock house down on Old 17 where he lived for a while, still there. And we built driveway walls on Rosina Avenue in Latonia. Built some stuff in Park Hills, and some up by DeVue Park in Kenton Hills.
Huh.
Mixed mortar for a long time with him.
Did you ever do any of Derek Hastings' homes? Remember Derek Hastings?
We didn't. No, those homes were already. I think those were older homes.
Were they?
Rebuilt
Yeah.
for us.
They were all stone houses.
Yeah,
I
they
think.
were stone, but they were. I think they were a different type of building than what we did.
Mm-hmm.
We only built the one rock house.
Derek's still alive.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
see him every once in a while. And when Larry Hensley and I
Yeah.
went out to visit him at his house about 6 months ago, I guess, or 8 months ago. Larry Hensley, he'd be with us here today if he wasn't, but he's down in Tennessee
Yeah.
with his horse down here, Connie. And he was a veteran from the service also.
Oh yeah. Larry was a good guy. Still
Good
is.
guy, yeah, he's got a lot of knowledge
Yes, he does.
on cars and other things. He's very intelligent.
Yes, he is.
But, well, and then you graduated from Simon Kenton High School with our class. And when did you first come up with the idea of going into the service?
I had thought of that even in high school. I got a job working for Decca Records in Cincinnati on Court Street. And I worked there, and I saw how much money the record salesman made. And I thought, I'd like to do that. Well, when I got the job, they told me, yeah, you could probably work your way into that. Well, in the meantime, I found out that you had to be 21. Of course, I was only 18. So I said, I can't wait till I'm 21 to get a job because you don't make much money as a stock boy in a record company. So I went and talked to the Air Force recruiter. And I took the test and I did okay on the test. And so I enlisted in the Air Force, and I left for the Air Force July the 9th of 1962.
Now, isn't that something, folks? Just like my brother did. My brother Gerald went into the Army. Actually, Mom had to sign the papers for him to go in because he went in
17.
at 17 and went into the Army that early off of Wolf Road where we grew up on Wolf Road there. And then, Ed, you went into the Air Force, and what was your first memories of the Air Force then?
Well, the first thing to remember is that was the first time I'd ever flown. And of course, I flew from Greater Cincinnati Airport in Boone County to San Antonio, Texas. And I arrived at Lackland Air Force Base for basic training. And I was in basic training for 6 weeks. And I graduated from basic training. I went to Amarillo, Texas, Amarillo Air Force Base in Amarillo, which has been now closed for years. And I I wanted to be a jet engine mechanic because my brother Jim was a car mechanic. So I thought, well, I'll be a mechanic. So I went to jet engine school for 2 or 3 months. Then I got to come home, and I come home on a train from Amarillo. And then from there, I was going to drive my car to California. I was stationed at Travis Air Force Base. Well, I went through Chisel Bridge and stopped behind a school bus, behind a car. And a guy come through Chisel Bridge and plowed in the back of my car and destroyed my car. So I ended up going to California on a train.
Oh boy.
And that was, I don't remember the month I got to California, but it probably was, I'm going to say it was probably September, October, November area. And I was stationed there for 4 years as a jet engine mechanic.
Mm-hmm. So that was your beginnings as a jet engine mechanic then?
I was a jet engine mechanic for 9 years.
And what type of engines did you work on?
I've worked on, it's easier to probably tell you the aircraft. The engines were T-56, T-34, those are turboprops. They're jet engines with propeller. I also worked on J-57s, TF-39s, TF-33s, J-65s. I worked on a lot of different engines, but I worked on a variety of aircraft. I worked on, well, they've been gone for years, C-133s, C-130s, C-141s, C-135s, C-5s, F-105s. So I did that for 9 years, and I was in Takli, Thailand for 1 year, 1 calendar year, from November of '66 to November of '67. Then I came back and got on a C-5 test program. So I had to go to Marietta, Georgia. And I flew with the C-5s out of Travis for 2 years because they had a lot of engine problems with the GE engines. So we flew in and out of Cam Ranh Bay, Vietnam. We would go to Hawaii. Well, we'd go to Texas and get munitions, and we'd go to Hawaii. From Hawaii, we would go to Guam, spend the night, and fly into Cam Ranh Bay early in the morning. And the part that I'll never forget was we hauled munitions to Vietnam. This was in the early 60s, probably 68, 69. And we would bring the remains of the soldiers killed back with us, back to Travis, where they would disperse them throughout the United States to be buried. And I did that for about 2 years. And then, because I did love the Air Force so much, I was a night field maintenance superintendent at Grissom in Indiana, the old Bunker Hill Air Force Base. And my boss was an E9, and he told me, since you love the Air Force so much, you should go into recruiting. So I went into Air Force recruiting, and I was an Air Force recruiter for 11 and a half years. I was a recruiter in Dayton, Ohio. I was a nurse recruiter and moved up to the squadron in Columbus. From there, I went to Rockford, Illinois as a flight supervisor. And I retired in August the 31st, 1982. I retired from Joliet, where I was a squadron superintendent, and I retired as a master sergeant in E7.
Mercy sakes alive. Now let's back up to that a little bit. What are some of the experiences you had as a recruiter? Was it difficult to recruit at that time, or was it?
No, I was in Dayton, Ohio, and now let me rephrase that. Dayton, Ohio, because the Air Force Base was right there at Wright Pat, a lot of the people we recruited were military dependents, so it was fairly easy recruiting. Rockford, Illinois, when I got there, had never made goal, had never even come close. I went there with a colonel named Colonel William Shepard, who was a great guy and a good personal friend of mine, who passed away a few years ago. He asked me to come up here, and my buddy Brian Healy went to Peoria, and we were both out of the Columbus area then. And we turned it around and actually made gold. The first month I was there, we had a goal. I had a goal of supposed to put 50 people in the Air Force. I had 13 recruiters, and they put in 5. The second month I was there, they put in 10, and my boss, the colonel, said, well, at least you're going in the right direction. So I had a good meeting with all my recruiters, and we had a father-son type of talk, and I found out why they weren't doing well. So I changed some of the regulations of how they were operating, which we operated legally, but we operated without some of the restrictions, because they had to keep all kinds of logs that were unnecessary. So we did away with them. The third month I was there, we had a goal of 51 and we put in 52. It's the first time they'd ever made goal. And after that, we never missed goal again.
That's interesting. And what did you find the caliber of the people that were interested in going into the service?
It's a mixed group. You find the person who is very pro-military and has always wanted to be in. Then you find the person that's looking for a job and doesn't have the qualifications necessary to do most jobs, so they can come in the military. Then you find, and probably some of my favorites, were the people that are patriotic and wanted to use the military as a means to get an education. Because, you know, the old GI Bill, and you meet the people that want to travel. Some people come in the military because of the adventure or the experience. Some of them come in because their great-grandfather maybe was in the Army in World War II. There's all kinds of different reasons why people join the military. The one thing they have in common, most of them love the country.
Yeah, a love of country.
Absolutely.
I think that's a key thing myself too.
Yeah, I do too.
I never will forget, I think I told you this story, when I left college down at the University of Kentucky. I was in what's called ROTC, Reserve Officers Training School, as a Air Force cadet, and I was what they call a cadet policeman. And I loved it so much that when I dropped out of school after the first, actually it started into the second semester, and because of some personal reasons that I had, concerns, I dropped out of school, and then I decided, well, I really love what I want to do. Well, I really love the service and the Air Force. I really enjoyed all my studies that I did there. So I took the test to go ahead and join the Air Force to try to get to be a pilot. And took the test and everything, and then you had to pass the physical also. Well, I failed the physical. I never did dream that I would fail the physical because, frankly, I weighed about 150 pounds then, 155, and was solid as a rock, ran the 100-yard dash, played basketball on the championship intramural team there at UK, which was a good team. And but I had an accident years ago with Philip Casson. I mentioned earlier to you guys, Philip Casson was about a couple years older than me, was one of about 16 kids, the Casson kids, on Rector Road, over back behind our property. And I had gotten a new bicycle for my tobacco money, and as a kid, and a Firestone bicycle. Well, I wasn't big enough, quite ready to ride it because of the size of the bike. And so Philip Casson came over and said, well, we can ride up to IGA market, Johnny's IGA market up at Atwood. And so we hopped on that bike and had me on the handlebars and had him pumping it, and the car up around Frank Jackson's Bend on Moffett Road ran us off the road. My foot went down into the spokes, broke all the spokes out of the front wheel, but stopped it and threw Philip off head first onto the pavement. And today, half of his tooth is still in Moffett Road.
Oh my gosh, oh my gosh.
As he loves to tell the story.
Oh, imagine.
And I wound up having to go eventually into the hospital because of a hydrocele that happened to me. And also I had a stricture in the urethra, which they didn't realize that I had. And so due to that being on my medical records, particularly the stricture in the urethra, the doctor called me in and said, "We can't take you." I said, "What do you mean you can't take me?" He said, "You can't pass the physical because we would have to have a specialist wherever we sent you to." Now, I was very upset and disappointed because of being in such great shape and everything. And I thought, well, I'd be able to go right into schooling on the Air Force, you know.
Wow.
Well, that was my pathway. But I have always had that in my heart and my mind. And even later in years, while you were over in Vietnam and Hanoi and those places abroad fighting for the country, I was back here leading demonstrations with the students at the community college and the fraternities as president of the student body, marches over to the federal building supporting you, the troops. And not necessarily that I agreed with the war or not, but we were supporting the troops. And
Absolutely.
we led marches over there and led blood drives. And I still have pictures from a lot of that, where us kids organized and did that at Northern Kentucky, which now Northern Kentucky University was Northern Kentucky College of the University of Kentucky.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm tickled that in 1968 we worked as students again. The fraternities and the student council worked to get Northern Kentucky State authorized by Governor Louis Nunn and Philip King and Art Schmidt and a bunch of the legislators, and that's where we first got the starting of Northern Kentucky University, 1968. And a lot of great legislators, Ken Harper and even Terry Mann later, Clyde Middleton later, but Phil King was one of the main ones, and Art Schmidt was one of the main ones that helped with that. And while you were over there, so I have had that love of the military ever since. And it's one of the things I really love about President Donald Trump, is that he rejuvenized the military
Absolutely.
with funding. And I wanted to ask you about that.
Yes.
But before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about, you stayed 20 years.
Right.
Now, what amount of your time was you in and out of those foreign countries over there?
Well, I spent 1 year in Totally, Thailand.
Yep.
Then I flew in and out of Vietnam, which I went to Vietnam from 2 years, and I was flying in and out of Vietnam and the Philippines and Okinawa. I have been to Laos, one time to Laos. I've been to Cambodia one time. I've never been to, I've been to, let me tell you where I have been. There's some place I can't tell you. I've been to Hawaii lots of times. Of course, there again, flying in and out. I've been to Wake Island. I've been pretty much all over the South Pacific. I've never been to Europe.
And what's the uniqueness about our military is that most of the planes you probably worked on now are sort of obsolete, aren't they?
Well, actually, the C-5 is still in service. The C-130 is still in service. The C-130 is still the mainstay of some of the tactical missions and also some of the cargo missions. The C-5 has been revamped now. It's a better plane now, and they've actually got another one, a C-17, that's very similar to it.
But it's amazing what they're coming up with now in
They've got
planes.
great planes. And I was on F-105s in Thailand. The F-105 was a fighter bomber, capable of pretty good supersonic classified speed. It could really honk, and it was a great job. Unfortunately, we lost an awful lot of pilots in Vietnam because of poor route planning from the United States. And I want to go back and touch on something while I'm thinking about it. When you were talking about it under President Trump, how the military is revamped, the military had fallen on hard times with Jimmy Carter. I was in when we fell on hard times. Couldn't get parts. This same thing happened under President Obama. President Obama hurt the military more than any president we've had other than Jimmy Carter. It came back a little bit under the Bushes, but it made major strides under President Trump now. The military now is stronger than it ever was, and it's actually because of President Trump, and that's my opinion.
Well, I totally agree with you. I have watched that from afar, but also having served with United States Congressman John Breckinridge in Washington when I was on his staff as field representative. There were three things I was in charge of, and the whole district was energy-related items, agriculture-related items, and education-related items, and worked with him. And of course, his brother was one of the upper echelon CIA people, and we had access to him. And the Congressman Breckinridge was a retired colonel from the Army, and so we were very much in tune with what was happening to the military. And I think that I can safely say that today we're better equipped with military equipment and readiness than we have ever been.
We are.
And thanks to Senator Mitch McConnell and to the United States Senate and President Trump and Donald Pence, or Mike Pence. Mike Pence is a good military man.
Absolutely.
And has some sons, I think, and
Yes, he does.
family in the military.
Yes,
And the and even the Space Force that President Trump has started will give us new technology to the space world, which, frankly, with the technology of your computers, with all of the new technology of warfare, it is a very important thing to have that new technology expanding and growing and experimentation with. Don't you agree?
Almost all the new technology has come about because of military improvements and NASA, space agency. A lot of the stuff we have now came about only because of those two things. But I'd like to go back on something you said. You mentioned about what a good guy Mike Pence was and about his son in the military. Joe Biden, who I will never vote for because he's a liar, and I hate liars and thieves. Joe Biden's son, Bo, served honorably in the military, and I give him credit for that. The one that died in a car accident, I believe. But his other son, Hunter, was thrown out of the military for doing drugs, cocaine. He's also made some terrible, terrible decisions and deals with Ukraine and China, which made him and Biden millions of dollars. And no matter what Biden says, he was very aware of that. Biden was as deeply involved as that as Hunter ever was. I have no use for Biden. I have none for Kamala Harris. I'm 100% going to support Trump and always have. I think it's time the United States used the country as a business because the government is a business and Trump is a businessman, and we've needed one for a long time.
Well, that pretty well answers that question.
Yeah.
As usual, you just like you were in high school, direct and to the point.
Yeah, I figured I'd be as direct as I could on it.
Well, that you can't get much, and I certainly agree with your thoughts there. Texas and Kentucky are maybe aligned on that.
Well, I'll tell you, here's something you'll get a kick out of this. Everybody that knows Texas and Kentucky will. In Kentucky, you have the KBA, Kentucky Bikers Association. In Texas, you have the TBA, Texas Bikers Association. In Kentucky, you have the TABC, or the KABC, Kentucky Alcoholic Beverage Control. In Texas, you have the TABC, Texas Alcoholic Beverage and Control. There is a lawyer here in Kentucky I'm not going to mention his name, but he's very famous. He can practice in Kentucky and Texas. One thing I have noticed living in both states, the laws in Kentucky and Texas are really similar on almost everything. It seems like if Kentucky thinks of something or Texas does, it goes to the other state, which really, if you think about it, makes very little sense, since between Kentucky and Texas, you've got a lot of states. You've got, if you go straight down to Texas from here, you've got to go through Tennessee, Arkansas, and of course, as most of you know, Texas is quite large. You can drive in Texas for, well, just to give you an example, from one side of Texas to the other is around 8 to 10 hours, depending on how fast you drive.
Right.
And that's east and west.
That's right.
North and south, if I come to Kentucky, it takes me to get out of Texas, because I live down by San Antonio. It takes me, no matter which direction I go, at least 3 or 4 hours to get out of Texas in any direction.
Any direction.
But the similarity between the two states on their laws is amazing.
Right, right. Well, that probably goes back to maybe the early pioneers
It probably does.
moving west and
Yeah.
history of the two states.
Of course, he was from Tennessee, but if you remember the famous words that Davy Crockett said in Congress, "You can all go to hell, I'm going to Texas."
Right. Well, now, Ed, let's go back to your life here then. So you spent those 20 years there in the service, and you've made several trips back to Kentucky, haven't you,
Yes, I have.
to visit?
Yes, sir.
And we're thrilled with that. And all those years as in mechanics, you've seen about every airplane that's made in your 20-year period, haven't
Pretty
you?
much.
And were some of those made in engines made in GE by GE?
Evendale, Ohio.
And right.
Absolutely.
So that provided a lot of jobs over there in
Sure
Ohio,
has.
didn't it?
Sure has.
Yeah. The now you're living in Texas now. You received quite a bit of education, though. I call it an Air Force education. It's almost like having a doctorate degree in the field that you worked in, and that is mechanics. You have to know a lot of things to be a mechanic, don't you?
Quite a few. Yeah, you have to know a lot, especially troubleshooting on the jet engines. When they break down, is you go from the simple to the complex. But if you spend a lot of time around jet engines, you get to the point where you actually know what you're doing pretty much on them. It takes a few years before you really get good on them.
Now, what about family? Do you have children yourself?
I have one son. He's in South Carolina. Works for the State Department.
Works for the State
Retired from the Air Force.
Retired from the Air
Yeah,
Force.
and I have another grandson who spent 6 years in the Air Force. I have another grandson that's a B-52 pilot right now. And a granddaughter that lives in Kyle, Texas.
Fantastic. I've got one nephew that's Josh Guyman's his name, a fantastic test pilot. And